Hi, this is Holding Safe Spaces. Uh, Originally, the discussion today was going to be about accountability. However, so many things have been going on in my life as of recent that made me want to focus more on triggers. And with that, we are going to be talking to Miles Morgan. He is a emotional resilience coach who's a trained therapist and definitely has grown even more as an entrepreneur. He basically turns people's inner chaos into inner control within 90 days. Um, so we're gonna lean into having an open discussion with Miles about triggers and where they come from and how we can maybe hone in and figure out a way to overcome those triggers. But we're going to just have an open discussion. And the first thing we're going to talk about that I think people may not realize with triggers is that it doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be angry, it's going to
Mhm.
result in anger. So, I guess, Miles, to you, is there a difference between being angered, being mad, or things just bothering you when it comes to various emotions, period?
Oh yeah, there's definitely a difference. When I think of like anger can like there's a you can think of it on a spectrum, right? You can think of it on a spectrum from just being a little irritated all the way to overwhelming rage. And I think about anger or kind of like the different flavors of anger. Also, in terms of like there's healthy anger, and then maybe there's anger that isn't as healthy or maybe it isn't as helpful because it goes against what we really want and what we really care about. So, healthy anger is like protective anger, like there's something that's important to you, there's a person that's important to you, and maybe that thing that's important feels like it's being threatened. Maybe it's a value that's important to you. Like if I value, I don't know, just come up with a value. Like if I value, I don't know, respect. I have a value of respect. And then if somebody does or says something that feels disrespectful, then that value is being threatened or infringed upon or violated. And so then I have a healthy sense of anger to want to protect that. And if we can listen to that anger, then and listen for like what is the message there, then it can direct us to like, okay, what is it that I want to protect, and what actions can I take to protect that? Another thing that I know about anger is like anger can sometimes be uh, kind of like a secondary emotion because anger for a lot of people is safe. Like it's safer to feel angry than it is to feel sad or hurt or vulnerable. So a lot of times what is actually happening for people when they feel anger is that okay, I'm showing anger on the outside, but on the inside, I'm really hurt. And I'm trying to protect myself and other people from seeing and feeling that hurt. It's better to show anger. But
So,
then, I'll go ahead.
no, I totally agree with that, but I think that focusing on healthy anger, that's always great, but I think it takes time to get there
Hmm.
because I think initially people aren't in tune with themselves or their emotions to be able to say, hey, this is healthy anger, and I'm
Hmm.
going to channel it the best way because
Yeah.
that's not the case for most people because people are naturally sponges,
Yeah.
Um, so that's what I see when it comes to anger. That's what I've experienced when it comes to anger.
Hmm.
Is that a lot of times it could be, hey, just a reactive sense. But I do agree with you with learning that anger and a lot of feelings that people do express are secondary emotions versus primary emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And when we're talking about primary emotions, that's when we get into triggers.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so that's what I see as, okay, we know that there's anger. Being mad is, kind of like a subsidiary to anger, and then being bothered is just a minute way of before you even blow up and become angry,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So I think triggers for me, the way that I see it is necessarily the primary emotion that a lot of people don't know how to identify
Mm-hmm.
and even know how to handle,
Yeah.
So how do to you, what are triggers?
Yeah. Just to go back to what you said before I answer that question, then because the unhealthy anger is like you said, when it shows up as a reaction, when it's out of control, like you're not actually choosing your response, you're just reacting, and then that reaction is destructive. It's harmful. It hurts yourself.
Very.
It hurts other people. When it makes things worse instead of better, then that's the unhealthy, you know, anger. Um, so yeah, in terms of what triggers are, the way that I think about triggers is that a trigger is a reminder. A trigger is you saw something or heard something or thought something or remembered something that is reminding you of something that happened in the past that was very painful. And the pain was that past memory. There's some neurobiology here, and it has to do with like the way that our brains and bodies store memories. When we're in a situation where something is happening to us and it's overwhelming, like it feels overwhelming, or it feels unbearable, or it feels intolerable, then that sets off our body's alarm system, like our fight, flight, freeze, survival system. And what happens is we record that event in our system as a threat. Like, oh my God, if I feel this, like I'm in this experience, I'm gonna die. I need to, and this is we're not thinking this consciously. It's all happening unconsciously. Like I feel like I'm gonna die. I need to protect myself. So what happens is our body kind of like logs that event in like this fragmented way. It's not like a continuous memory, it's this fragmented memory, and it's this emotional memory. So it's not even like necessarily clear words or clear story in the memory. It's just that big emotional, overwhelming emotional imprint. So, and that gets stored in it. So then fast forward to the future, let's say I'm walking down the street and I smell something, and that smell reminds me of that memory back then. You can call that smell in and of itself a trigger. I get triggered and I respond or react to that smell with all the same fight, flight, freeze response as if I'm back in that painful experience, even though I'm not. It could be a facial expression, like a face that somebody makes. It could be a word. It could be, and what happens is like when that happens, then we get flooded with overwhelming emotions all over again. And all of these defense responses that are unconscious and out of our control, that, it's three categories. It's more than three categories, but the big three are fight, fight, and wait, what did I say? Fight, flight, and freeze. Like those get triggered automatically. So now we're having those versions of our reactions that feel out of our control. So then we're in a triggered state. And a lot of the time, it takes a long time to come down from that. People can be in triggered states for hours to days to weeks and not even notice, not even recognize it. And there are a whole bunch of other things that are, we could spend a lot of time talking about the ways that that shows up, the different, everybody has their own, way of dealing with it, but that's the gist of it.
I think that, like I said, recently I have been, I actually just had a breakthrough, to be honest. I recently just had a breakthrough because um, I had been going through, um, I just recently had an issue with somebody that was really close to me, and I got angry, like blow up angry.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, okay, this is the anger that I have, but I know it's coming from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had a discussion with my therapist this past week, literally the next day, because well, that was my scheduled therapy appointment anyway. So uh so I'm expressing to my therapist that this situation just happened to me the previous day, and how I reacted was a just a just a quick blow up. I see red. I cannot rationalize
Mm-hmm.
anything.
Mm-hmm.
And while we were working through this, I also was able to use my past relationship. What experience that I had where I did the
Yep.
exact same actions
Yep.
in my most recent past relationship a few months back. And I started correlating the two. Like,
Yep.
okay, I am literally like angered. I'm not calm. I'm not rational. Um, but what is getting me there? What is this that's getting me there? And this is when we talk about the trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And what I realized working through my therapist, and like I said, this is mind blowing to me. It's being ignored.
Mm.
It was that simple. One thing that said, that's what turns you from 0 to 100. Because there's no gradual for me. I can be calm with you being, doing something that I might not like, right? But it's the ignoring part that takes me to another level.
Mm-hmm.
It's literally, like I said, I'm so happy to know this,
Yep.
because now I can figure out how I need to migrate around that. Because for me, it's it's not about the action. It's about, then, to me, it even goes further into more triggers, because it was then identified. I don't like being ignored because I, at some point growing up, I felt like I wasn't seen. So if you ignore me, then it's taking me to that place.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And so like I'm just mind blown by all of this. I'm like mind blown by all of this. And what it has done is say, hey, okay, we need to stick within this angered space, and now let's support this place where you felt like you weren't being valued or seen. and and then the ignoring is what sets it off.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because also what I learned is, when you ignore me, now I'm steadily reaching out. I'm steadily bam, 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 because I'm trying to be seen. I'm trying to validate that.
Yep. And would you categorize that? I don't know if you know this, but do you think that's like a fight, a flight, or a freeze response?
Oh,
Like,
it's a fight. It's a
yeah,
fight.
yeah.
It's not a flight. I'm not running anywhere, because if anything, I'm now coming towards you at full steam ahead
Yep.
without trying to retreat. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, no, I need you to see me. I need you to make me feel of some importance. And it just pisses me off when you don't. And I literally had this from the fact of this friendship where this happened, and I was able to trace it back to my past relationship, trace it back to other times in which I've gotten this angry, because a lot of people don't see it, but a lot of people won't see it because, one, you're not that important to me. I haven't been 100% vulnerable with you where I felt like you owe me that. Even though no one owes me anything. But the fact that I've released myself to you is like, no, this is where that vulnerability comes in, and this is what I need from you, and when you're not giving it, then it's a problem.
Yeah.
Versus people who I'm not 1,000% vulnerable with, then it's no issue for me.
Yep.
It's only then when I undress myself in all aspects with certain people that are 1,000% important to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I learned, and to me, it's like, oh, okay, this is identification for me.
Yep.
Now I can move forward to finding out healthy ways to channel that, because I honestly have not dealt with it in the most healthiest way because I
Mm.
wasn't able to identify
Right. You can't.
it.
I don't know if I
So,
could. It was feedback there, but like you
yeah.
can't manage what you can't see. So yeah, just being able to see that for a lot of people, just making the connection is that one of the first parts to a breakthrough.
Yeah, so I would ask, the question is, and do you have any triggers that you feel like takes you there? One thing about you is that you're, for the most part, very stoic and very just cool as a cucumber all the time. But I wonder, like, do you have any triggers that may,
Yeah.
you know, take you
So,
there?
so many. First, I'll say so many, but what I'll say is a lot of it is like I had triggers, but because of my work and just all of the personal development experiences I've put myself through, and everything that I've learned, I know how to, once I recognize that I have a trigger about something, I know how to like heal so that it's no longer a trigger. But I had a lot of triggers. I had triggers. I can name the primary emotions. And kind of like some of the situations. I had triggers around guilt and shame. I had triggers like fear of causing harm, which is guilt for me. I had triggers about let me see, I'm gonna try to actually go in. What if I did something wrong? So any cue that maybe somebody might not mess with me as much as I thought they did, like vibe with me. And I'm like, oh, what if I did something wrong that made them not like me? Um, that would cause like this guilt spiral, this fear spiral, anxiety. Really, it showed up as anxiety. Uh, I used to get triggered about at work, like, what if I'm not creating enough value? So if my boss was anything, it could be anything,
Hmm.
like it's so many different things, but the trigger would be like, oh, I'm concerned that I'm not creating enough value, which really is about being wanted. So my trigger was rooted in my childhood, where when my dad left because he had to, he went into recovery. And at that time, when I was a kid, kids, we don't know how to, kids don't have the perspective to know, to understand adult struggles. As a kid, everything is about you. That's just how we rationalize. So when my dad went into recovery, I internalized that as, oh, I must have done something wrong that made my dad not want me. And so then anytime a situation that reminded me of that showed up in the future with friends and at work, I would get triggered into anxiety. So my a lot of my triggers showed up as anxiety, and it was so bad for a long time, Carla, that number one, I didn't even recognize how anxious I was because I was dissociating from it. That's another thing with triggers. Things will be so uncomfortable that we'll be numb to it. Like we won't even be aware of the emotional charges that we're carrying in our body to even
Mm-hmm.
know that we're triggered because it's safer that way. And in a way, it is safer up to a point. Um, but eventually, I was like, "Oh snap!" I'm. I got to a point, Carla, where I was anxious from the time that I woke up, put my feet on the ground, anxious thoughts, all everything I just told you, different versions, different cues in my family at work, to the time that I went to bed, and even while I was trying to sleep, I had insomnia. But all of that, when I unpacked it, was like I was just getting triggered because I had unresolved trauma,
You
basically.
haven't resolved it.
Yeah.
Exactly, because that's exactly, first and foremost, Miles, I want to say that you just made me realize a couple of things too. When you just talked about guilt, when you talked about, feeling unwanted, which to me is also a part of being ignored.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
But I never even considered guilt as being a trigger.
Mm-hmm.
Because to me, now that I think about it, every dang on day, Miles, I
Mm-hmm.
feel guilty about something, and a lot of times it doesn't even have to do with me.
Yep.
And uh, what I can say is that, when you are a kid, you don't, all you see is just you. And you know what my sister Wavita says to me is that you're definitely valid in feeling the way you feel. However, it's your own perception. But when you're a kid, your own perception is just that. And
Mm-hmm.
that consists of just you.
Yep.
And that's why it's like, okay, well, maybe people didn't necessarily exclude you, but that's how I felt.
Yep.
That's what I perceived it to be. So I think a lot of triggers may come from, like you said, from experiences that you have that weren't the best, or knowing or seeing or anything can be a trigger that can cause you to go down this path. But it's like, how do you figure it out? And I got to the point where, when this past week, when this situation happened, I was like, I need to figure out why I am so angry.
Yep.
And this only happens with people that I truly love.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and it was like, no, I need to figure this out. So that's where I am. And what I also understand is that I don't necessarily believe that all triggers are associated to only trauma, though.
Yeah.
It can be anything
Yeah.
that can be a trigger that may cause you to be uncomfortable or not feel like you're in a safe space.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. I think a lot of people struggle with that point that you said, because if you had asked me years and years ago, if you had asked me if I had trauma, my answer would have been no. Because what do we think of when we think of trauma? We think of kind of like the worst case scenario, right? Like it's some type of extreme abuse or some extreme accident, or violence, or war. Like that's what people think of when they think of trauma. But maybe this might help people, is that maybe a more useful term, because trauma represents the most extreme version of emotional wounds.
Mhm.
So we can think in terms of like an emotional wound that I have, right? And that all the only conditions for an emotional wound is that at the time that something happened, the way that I felt was overwhelming or unbearable or intolerable, so much so that I pushed it away instead of dealing with it. And
Exactly.
and we don't push it away. I'm gonna just keep making that point. We don't do it consciously. It happens automatically. And so that could be experiences of rejection. It could be experiences of failure. It could be experiences of disappointment. And that doesn't necessarily. It could be experiences of disconnection, like we get disconnected from our caregivers, disruptions in attachment to people we love, neglect, which is can be just as painful as active abuse, but it's harder to
To
identify,
identify.
you know.
Yeah.
And so all of those things, regardless of whether you call it trauma or not, it's a wound that because we don't look at it, it doesn't heal. And we need to look. It needs its time. We need to go back safely. We need to go back, identify the wound, and then do the work to heal it. And when we heal it, then the triggers they start to melt away.
Absolutely. And I think also, I hear a lot of times people say, hey, let's communicate. Communication is the key. And it's like, yes, you can communicate, but if several people are in a room and they all have different triggers,
Mm-hmm.
and they're acting off of those triggers, in which they can all be acting from a different spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
It may be humorous, it may be sarcasm, it may be anger,
Mm-hmm.
but it doesn't matter that you're talking if you aren't identifying the triggers that you're having or
Yep.
experiencing in order to properly communicate with each other,
Yep.
because all it's doing is making more of a toxic situation.
Yeah.
You know,
It's re-traumatizing. It's
exactly.
yeah.
And that was another thing I wanted to touch on, and I see this a lot, and I'm just all the way. I'm at the point where I'm just all the way transparent with how I feel and what I think, and just like I said, this for me is a safe space. It's a space to be able to maybe say things or express things that you might not want to or feel comfortable doing anywhere else. And I'm going to be honest, I see a lot of when I see people on social media and they're making fun of things or making fun of people. To me, that comes off. It for one, it's a trigger for me because it's just bothersome. But but also, I think people make fun of other people or other things because they have some unhealed triggers that they're not dealing with
Oh,
or
for
they
sure.
haven't identified or dealt with.
Yep.
It's things that I see. So it's other ways that triggers can come out. It doesn't mean that it has to be angry. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't mean that it has to even be anxiousness. It can
Mm-hmm.
come out in humor or sarcasm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, hey, when you're making fun of somebody falling and being embarrassed, have you thought about what's underneath those layers that you might have that you're thinking that this is funny?
Mm-hmm.
You know?
Yeah, that's kind of like getting into the whole idea of like our defense responses, the automatic defense responses that kick in to save us from dying, basically. That's the most extreme way of putting it, but that's how our body is processing it.
Hmm.
Like, okay, automatically, what can I do to create safety? And for some people, it's humor. Like, if I
Hmm.
inject some laughter, then that can make this more tolerable. You know,
Hmm.
uh, some people become people pleasers. You know, if I can make that's me, by the way. Like, people pleasing
Me
was one of
too.
my defense responses. Like,
Hmm.
let me put myself aside and do whatever I can to be really likable. So being likable was a way for me to avoid the pain of being unwanted. Because if I'm
Hmm.
likable, then nobody's gonna reject me, you know.
Yeah.
So I thought. But the
And
thing about it is in trying to be likable, I shut down parts of myself. So even if people accept me, they not accepting the whole me, and I don't ever feel the true acceptance that I'm really craving, you know?
because you're not your full authentic self.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that actually one of my friends had just said to me. Um, he was just like, "You are really the kindest person." Actually, Pat just told me this too. I'm like the kindest person, and I am. But then he said to me, he said, "But I don't think people know that you can also get angry, and they don't accept it. And when they don't accept it, then that may also fall in line with then for me to internalize and say, hey, that's then them not accepting it is then me not being seen.
Mhm.
And uh, what I realize is that you, you can shrink yourself even when you don't think you are
Yep.
because you don't want those type of issues. Like
Yep.
for me, as soon as I combat or disagree, and especially as of late, then I feel like I'm easily discarded. And that's what life is showing me right now. So it's like, okay, so when I stand up for myself or I put my foot down or show you that I'm unhappy with this situation, this is the response I get as opposed to, hey, let's talk it out, let's work it out and try to figure it out.
Yeah.
As friendships, as whatever capacity it's been,
Yeah.
you know.
And that's
Um,
really difficult because it's like what I'm hearing you say there is like, okay, I'm doing something, I'm taking different actions to work so that I can stop being triggered, so that I can stop making these same mistakes. But then you take those different actions, and what is that? A setup to get triggered again. And that's it's hard. We can laugh at it now, but when we feel
yeah.
it,
I mean,
it's
it doesn't feel
frustrating.
good, but it's the truth.
Yeah, it's defeating. Like people can feel like, dang, I'm working so hard, and it's defeating. But uh I don't know. I don't know what to say to that. I do know what to say, but I'm like, maybe that's hold on, let me check in. What's there for me around that?
Mhm. Check in, take your beat.
I think you had used a frame or term that is is what that term reminds me of is this idea of life reveals so that we can heal. So
Mm,
when we're moving into these new spaces and then we're getting triggered all over again, it can feel bad. It can feel like we're not making progress. But every time we get triggered, that's just an opportunity to look. It's an opportunity to identify and be with what's coming up. So it feels really shitty. And that's part of the process. There's another term where it's like, in order to get out of hell, you have to go through misery.
yeah.
So it's like getting out of it does not feel good, but every time you use it as an opportunity to look, then that's the next healing step.
And I think that's so true. But like I said, for me, the way that I see it is being able to identify these things first. Because, like I said, I was blown away by the fact of the realizations that I've just had within this past week
Mm-hmm.
over dealing with how I've from a kid when I get angry, because that's not seen often for me. Um, but now that I'm now at the age that I am and I'm able to identify it instantly made me feel good,
Yep.
even though it's still shitty.
Yep.
It's still a
Yeah.
shitty place.
Mm-hmm.
It still doesn't, but the fact that I know that now there's a possibility for me to do some type of healing in
Mm-hmm.
this process because something has been identified to me
Yes.
and I was able to relate it based off of relationship to relationship with different people. It was like, okay, so now I feel like I have promise.
Yep.
That's what it feels like to me.
Yes. Yes.
And and before I would say that triggers show up in people's lives often, and they can hinder you from your day to day. Like you said, Miles, you would get up and you would feel anxiety from the time you hit your foot from out of your bed,
Mm-hmm.
and going forward, and even with people pleasing, these can hinder you, even though it's you're trying to migrate through life, but you're having up boulders or putting up walls because of these particular triggers. And I think
Yep.
everybody does that.
Yep.
Everybody does that. It's just, hey, how can we not?
Yeah.
And that's one of the things, like for me, one of my big sisters, as I call her, has said one of her triggers is inconsistency. And
Mm-hmm.
it's like not inconsistency of herself, but inconsistency of other people that she have allowed in her life. And then now that makes, me question, okay, well, this is your reaction to the inconsistency. And like you said, it's like fight, flight, or freeze.
Mm-hmm.
So now let's fight, flight, or freeze. But what if, Miles, this is the question,
Mm-hmm.
because what if you've fought and then you flight, um, then what? I guess one of the things that I want to ask you is maybe you can elaborate quickly on what does that mean when you fight, you flight, and you freeze?
Oh, like what are versions? That's a
Yeah,
lot.
what does it mean?
So one of the easiest ways to talk about fight is fighting has to do with this idea of vigilance or hypervigilance. It has to do with it's more aggressive. It has to do with more approach, more attack. What are different ways that fighting come up? Like fighting is you can literally like it might be starting an argument.
Hmm.
It might be uh
Not ending an argument.
say it again.
Not ending an argument.
Not ending it
Continuing.
like you're right, that hypervigilant. Um, fighting could be uh kind of like you like a version of like perfectionism, like you go really hard, like it can show up as workaholism. Like I'm
Hmm.
just gonna try to get control, like getting control over people or a situation or you know like the fighting response often leads to burnout. So I'm gonna keep going. Flight is avoidance, is running away, is shutting down. So a lot of times the interesting thing is in relationship dynamics, like it'll be one stereotype is like the woman who's complaining to her man about what she's this is like heteronormative relationship dynamics, but like a woman who comes home or she's complaining to her man about not doing her chores and she's just going. That's fighting. A man might not actually run away. He might just shut down or stonewall, just not say nothing. Go
Hmm.
and or go watch TV. So distraction is a way of flight. Like instead of dealing with this problem, I'm gonna go binge watch whatever is on Netflix.
He's running away. It's
Yep.
just simple flight.
Drinking, smoking our pain away is a version of flight. Uh, and like you said, literal running away. Freeze is really like I'm gonna do nothing. Freeze is like the deer in the headlight response. Freeze is like my version of freeze used to be like, okay, I don't think fighting is not gonna get me out of this situation. Running away, I'm gonna just do nothing. Like doing nothing, no response, just
Like the
stopping
mannequin challenge.
the
Like
mannequin
just
challenge.
stop, freeze, and act like it doesn't exist and sweep it under the rug.
Yep, yep.
Okay.
Sleeping stuff away. Freeze and flight can, that might be a little takes a bit to is this fight or freeze. But yeah,
Hmm.
those responses. Oftentimes when you are asking a question of like, what do you do after? So what happens is you'll get some temporary relief, but it doesn't truly resolve the problem.
Hmm.
So what happens is you're gonna end up back in the same situation, a different version of the same situation all over again, and it's that. that hamster wheel experience. So the only
Yeah.
thing that really resolves it is, well, this might be a little more complicated answer, but the simple way is like healing and integration. The only way to really resolve it is uh to turn towards the thing that's causing you pain and to be with it without those reactions,
Yeah.
and in a context of safety and love, and to reprocess what happened to you to
Yeah.
change the way that it's stored in your body. And
Yeah.
that's real hard work, but you know that's what gets the job done.
Or it's going to continue to be a repetitive cycle,
Exactly.
basically, if you
Yep.
don't.
Yep.
One of the things that also, I'm not really sure how to feel about it, but when people say these are your triggers, so I'm triggered by something, but these are your triggers. But as someone that's receiving or being on the opposite end of the person that's having these triggers, what does it look like for them to try to help, or is it even a possibility of them trying to help someone with their triggers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm gonna answer that one like mostly less from a professional stance and more from like what I learned as a human trying to do
Mm-hmm.
relationships with
Mm-hmm.
unresolved trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So what I learned is that it's important for me to understand my trauma response patterns. So it's important for me to, I know we talked about not everybody has trauma, but I'm gonna just say it how I understand it. It's important for me to understand that one, I have emotional wounds and trauma, which means that I have triggers. Okay, I need to know what my triggers are. I need to know when I get triggered, these are the ways that I'm likely to respond. I also need to understand that I might not necessarily have control when I'm triggered. I might not have control over when I'm responding this way. And I need to learn, okay, what do I need to create safety in a healthy way when I end up in this situation? All I can really do is communicate that self understanding to my loved ones.
Mm-hmm.
I can communicate, hey, when this happens, I get triggered, and this is how I'm likely to respond, and this is what I need in those situations.
Mm-hmm.
My loved ones have a choice. You know, they can choose from their own, creativity, how they might want to adapt to avoid, let's say, bumping into my broken arm. You know, like it's
Mm-hmm.
just that my broken arm is an emotional wound instead of a real body wound. So they, now that they have that information, if they love me, they'll adapt in ways that work for them.
Mm-hmm.
Or it might be like, hey, our trauma is clashing. We're re-traumatizing one another. So maybe the healthier thing is for us to not do relationship right now
Mm-hmm.
until we both can, work through some of it.
Identify what they are.
Yeah.
Um, but I think it, and I'm speaking from a standpoint of not just romantic relationships, non-romantic relationships,
Family.
because family,
Yeah.
family, friendships, I think it's unfair to say, hey, these are my triggers and expect 100% for people to conform quickly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's realistic, and I don't think it's fair.
Mm-hmm.
And I also don't think it's fair on the other side either. But I think when it's been communicated
Mm-hmm.
and you don't try, then that just shows what value you have to the receiving end.
Yeah.
Um, where your space is.
Yeah.
Um, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to shrink yourself. It means, hey, I'm willing to put in this work,
Mm-hmm.
and vice versa. It's
Mm-hmm.
I think, and that comes from, you know, family, friends, romantic relationships, anything.
Mm-hmm.
And it would make a lot of things a lot easier if people then didn't just focus just on themselves and look to see, hey, look at this person or identify this from that person.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also not fair to think that it's just about that other person and not about yourself either.
Exactly. I think that's a big mistake that I have experienced where in the past I was doing the work to identify like my and communicate my triggers, but the other person wasn't showing up in the
Mhm.
relationship able to say like, okay, and here, like, it's kind of like when somebody is reacting without recognizing that their reaction is a trigger response, but
Mhm.
they're blaming me for having a trigger response.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
that one-sided thing, and it's like we both need to understand we both have triggers and trigger responses, and if I know that something is triggering to somebody that I love,
Mhm.
naturally, I wanna, okay, what can I change so that I'm not contributing to re-traumatizing them?
And I think though that people who don't look at it that way are just selfish people. I'm going to be honest, when you don't take into consideration and you just focus on what the reaction was versus what may be causing this reaction.
Mhm,
And it can be both ways, because a reaction always is going to come from an action and vice versa. So, well, not really vice versa, but action is always going to result in a reaction. But it takes two people, or well, whoever who was involved, to actually look at that and say, hey, let's sit down and try to identify this and these as being issues,
mhm,
and being mature enough to say, hey, let's work through them, because maybe our reactions weren't the best. you
mhm,
know I'm gonna be honest. My reaction to a couple of things that triggered me, because like I said, I'm just learning this past week what my triggers are, you know caused me to do some really outlandish, out of character things, before. But now it's like, now that I'm understanding what these triggers are, it's honestly me saying, uh okay, well, I'm going to work on myself and figure it out. But at the same time, the people who didn't take that into consideration of my triggers, fuck you.
mhm,
That's where
yep,
I am.
mhm,
Like, this is where I stand right now in this new place of identification
mhm,
and revelation.
yeah. Just
You know,
because
so.
we love each other
Mhm.
doesn't mean that we have to share space. If
Mhm.
actually, if we love each other and sharing space is causing one another harm, then the most loving thing to do might be for
Mhm.
us to not share space.
Yeah.
You know?
And the thing but I would say that that's true. But if you've at least identified it and you've tried.
Mhm.
I think,
Right.
because if you don't try or you haven't identified it, to me, that's a flight reaction.
Yep. You beat me to
You
it.
know, you
Yep.
you, you just said, nope, I'm not even gonna try. I'm just
Yep.
gonna go this way.
Yeah.
To me, and that's where it's different. But I think now I want to go into, how do you think it's possible to overcome triggers?
Yeah.
We did kind of talk on that a little bit with
Mhm.
integration and self work, but for me, like I said, for me to even identify my triggers, I've had to go. I go to therapy. I've been in therapy for a while, but I did take a break. I did take a break, and but now that I'm back into therapy, that has I feel like this is a new way. This is a way for me to maybe get to overcoming the triggers that I
Yeah. Yeah.
have. Yeah.
Definitely. I think a lot of it is just gonna be therapy. Because you need to go to therapy in order to get the tools therapy or coaching. So you need specifically a trauma informed therapist or a
Mhm.
trauma informed coach, because not everybody is. I wasn't a trauma informed coach for a long time, and so there was just some issues that my clients kept dealing with that I didn't, as a coach, I didn't have the tools to help them with. Um but how do you actually overcome triggers? First, I'll speak to like a mistake. Even if I think the field of psychology and self-development is has been going through a renaissance in the last couple decades, where we have been understanding the true role of trauma and emotional wounds and a lot of the difficulties that people have, even at other and different things that psychiatrists and psychologists diagnose. But one of the mistakes that people tend to make when they're trying to overcome their triggers is pushing through. Like, I'm gonna just try to push through this. I'm gonna just try to, the idea of overcoming, like, I'm gonna just try to overcome it, uh, or stuff it away, suppress it. That's a mistake that doesn't work. It goes, that's whole same thing. The other mistake is, okay, I'm gonna try to look at this. I'm gonna try to turn towards it. But there's a trap in trying to heal trauma, which is the moment we try to like turn towards the painful thing, it's so overwhelming. It can be so overwhelming for us that trying to turn towards it and heals it triggers us all over again. And
Mm.
so what people need are a lot of really robust tools to create safety in their body. You have to know how to create safety. You have to know how to activate the part of your nervous system that has to do with like groundedness and secure attachment and compassion and love. And there are lots of tools for that. There's breath work, there's visualization. So a lot of the stuff that I learned is like you can create a secure attachment figure just in your imagination. And even though it's in your imagination, it still activates the parts of your nervous system that has to do with secure attachment. Going to sacred place, having a sacred place like in nature, in your imagination, and different types of body work like yoga, all of that types of stuff. But you have to create that safety first. Then you talk to the part of yourself that's holding the pain, that inner child or that wounded part. It might not be a child, it could be a teenager or a part of you, like some whenever you had the pain, basically. You have to listen to that part and revisit like what happened? What's the truth of my life here? What happened? What didn't happen that should have happened? What's the conflicts that I felt and attachment? What's the impact of all of that on my life, on me, like how I've been carrying it? You got to see that full picture, the full narrative of the truth. And when you can do that, and with all of that safety, then it changes. Remember at the beginning, we talked about how stuff gets stored in our bodies as painful memories. Well, that memory, the way that it's stored in our bodies is no longer painful. Now it's stored with love and understanding and groundedness and wisdom. And you come out on the other side of that with a new perspective, with a new truth about your life, with more wisdom. But also, you actually have changed your neurobiology. You've changed the memory, the way that it's stored. And then the next time you encounter that same triggering situation is not going to be as triggering. You're going to have more control, more mindfulness, more choice than you had before.
So I want to say one thing. I want to interject for a second. Um, when you said that just moving past it, and that doesn't work. And I think with whether you're a woman, whether you're a man, whether you're whatever you identify as, whether you're black, white, whatever race, one thing that people tend to rely on as us as human beings, as a whole culture, is simply you're strong. Be strong.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what's, to me, it's what's wrong. And that falls in line with what doesn't work, because you're taught, nope, I'm just gonna move past this, I'm just gonna just let it be, and all of these types of things, when you being strong is not allowing you to overcome
Mm-hmm.
what issues and challenges that you have emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing is like, hey, just sit in it. And somebody had just told me that with what I've been dealing with, is just sit in it, and try to channel it,
Mm-hmm.
and breathe. Like,
Yep.
I know, and one app I use is Breathe Relax, and I've been using it for years because of my anxiety, and it does work. It's the problem is my discipline sucks, so
Mm-hmm.
I don't do it constantly. But when I get very overly stimulated, another thing that I've learned in therapy, and it falls in line with what you said, is having a mental thought of something that's relaxing to
Mm-hmm.
you. And it doesn't matter what it is, something that's relaxing that can get you to turn it into that place. So what I'm learning after with this conversation, after talking to you, is that, hey, I might already have some tools that I
You
can
do.
use
Yeah, for sure.
from therapy
Yep.
that can help me with this new revelation of this trigger that I have,
Mm-hmm.
and how to hone in on it.
Yep. Because one
So,
of the other things that I'll add is like, because when you're looking at the truth of what happened to you, it's not just reviewing the memory, it's also allowing yourself to feel the feelings that you couldn't feel before because you didn't have the tools, but now you do.
hmm yeah, 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 for sure. So um I think that this is something that can be very helpful to people, because I think people just say, "Hey, this is a trigger," but what are you going to do about the trigger?
You don't
That
just,
doesn't mean
yeah.
that you just let it continue to fester and be a trigger, and it just is what it is.
Mhm.
Especially when you've identified your trigger,
Mhm.
you
Mhm.
know. But now you might have to peel back a little bit more layers and figure out, why is this a trigger to you?
Yep.
And it definitely takes work, because like we both have talked about, there's a difference between a primary and a secondary emotion. Your secondary emotion is just the anger, it's just the buildup, it's just the reaction. But the primary emotion is where it all homes from, and trying to figure that out, and then peeling back even deeper layers, as Candy Cane says, just
Mhm.
peel back those deeper layers. And so I think that this should be something that people can take from. And I want you, Miles, to say more about who you are and what you have, and talk about your company and things of that nature, where people can find you as well, because I definitely want you to continue to thrive, and I definitely want you on again.
Mhm.
So so go ahead, Miles.
Yeah. So, I a lot of my work, my biggest sense of accomplishment, and I think what makes me different is that I help people at that intersection of understanding that, I have people, we have dreams, we have things that we want to create, we have a vision of ourself and our life. People want to self actualize. And what I have learned is that a lot of some of the biggest and most difficult to deal with blocks that people have in trying to get there tends to be on the emotional side. Like, it's easy for us to have a goal and see something get in the way that's external and deal with that external thing. you know, raise more
Yeah.
money or whatever. But what about the pattern of self-worth or, you know, fear that's preventing us from raising the money or charging a price that we or managing or moving through an obstacle or a challenge. So what I do is I help people identify those blocks. Like you said, like, okay, I notice I'm having this experience, but what is it really rooted in? I help people identify it. I help people uh, learn the frameworks and the tools. Some of it is mental, some of it is, a lot of it is emotional and deeply embodied. I help people learn those things and clear those blocks. And then I help them translate it into strategy. Like, okay, how am I going to change the way that I'm approaching and designing my life so that I can feel a sense of fulfillment and joy and peace on a daily basis as I'm playing to achieve really crazy goals.
Hmm.
So that's what I do. That's how I help people. If you guys, if anyone who's listening wants to learn more, the best way to learn more is to follow me on Instagram. My Instagram handle is Love Thy Work. So that's LOVETHYWORK. You can hear me talking about some of these topics. You can shoot me a DM and we can schedule a call for you to learn more. And I'm happy to share. One thing that I'm launching in the next month is a course specifically for educators and people in the educational leadership sector. And it's just a 90-day journey to turn your inner chaos into inner control and inner mastery and inner peace, and giving you those tools so that even after that 90 days, you can continue to do that work. So yeah,
Okay.
that's it.
Well, I really appreciate you and thank you. Um, Thank everybody for listening in. And this, I hope you take something from this. Identify your triggers and deep dive is a little bit further than it just being the anger and uh, the humor or sarcasm or wherever it may be. Maybe do a little bit more deep diving. So thank you for enjoying holding safe spaces.
Yeah, and thank you for creating this safe space and inviting me to participate in it.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right. Have a good one.